At approximately 5:00 p.m. on October 27, 1962, Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov stood in the sweltering control room of Soviet submarine B-59, somewhere in the Caribbean Sea near Cuba, and listened to his captain order the arming of a nuclear torpedo. 36 years old, 15 years in the Soviet Navy, Brigade Chief of Staff for the entire submarine flotilla. Arkhipov had survived a nuclear reactor accident just 1 year earlier. He'd been exposed to radiation levels that killed 8 of his crewmates. Now he faced something even more dangerous. Captain Valentin Savitsky wanted to fire a T-5 nuclear torpedo at the American warships above them, a weapon with a 10-kiloton yield, 2/3 the power of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. Soviet protocol required unanimous consent from 3 officers to launch nuclear weapons. The captain voted yes. The political officer voted yes. Arkhipov was the 3rd vote. He said no. That single word may have prevented World War III, the death of perhaps 500 million people, the end of human civilization as we know it. At 5:00 p.m. on October 27, 1962, one man stood between humanity and nuclear holocaust, and nobody on the surface knew how close they'd come. The world had no idea the submarines carried nuclear weapons. The Americans thought they were dropping harmless practice depth charges as signals. They were actually pushing a desperate Soviet crew toward launching the first nuclear weapon used in combat since 1945. October 27, 1962 would become known as Black Saturday, the most dangerous day of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest the Cold War ever came to going nuclear. That same day, an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba. Major Rudolph Anderson died instantly when Soviet missiles tore his aircraft apart at 70-500 feet. The first and only American killed by enemy fire during the entire crisis. That same day, another American U-2 accidentally flew into Soviet airspace near Alaska, nearly triggering a nuclear response from Moscow. And deep beneath the Caribbean, on submarine B-59, 3 Soviet officers were deciding whether to start World War III. 2 said yes, 1 said no. Let's talk about how we got there, and why Vasily Arkhipov's decision matters more than almost any other single choice made during the entire Cold War. The Soviet Union had a problem in October 1962. American spy planes had photographed Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles being installed in Cuba, nuclear weapons 90 miles from Florida. President John F. Kennedy announced a naval blockade. The US Navy would stop and search every ship heading to Cuba. The Soviets called it an act of war. On October 1, 1962, 4 Soviet Foxtrot-class diesel-electric submarines departed from Sida Bay on the Kola Peninsula. Their destination, Cuba. Their mission, establish a naval presence to counter American aggression. B-36, B-59, B-130, B-4. Each submarine was 295 feet long, crew of 78 officers and sailors, powered by 3 diesel engines, producing 6,000 horsepower combined. Standard armament, 22 torpedoes loaded into 10 tubes. But one torpedo on each submarine was different. The T-5, nuclear-tipped, 10-kiloton warhead, the RDS-9 nuclear device developed by Soviet weapons scientists in the mid-1950s. The crews knew about them, the Americans did not. Soviet naval doctrine normally required approval from Moscow to use nuclear weapons, but these submarines would be operating thousands of miles from home. Radio communication would be difficult, maybe impossible while submerged. So the Soviet Admiralty gave the submarine commanders extraordinary authority. If they believed war had started, if they came under attack and couldn't reach Moscow for instructions, 3 officers could authorize the use of nuclear torpedoes: the submarine captain, the political officer, and the brigade chief of staff. On most Soviet submarines, only 2 officers needed to agree. But because these submarines carried nuclear weapons, 3 signatures were required. B-59's brigade chief of staff was Vasily Arkhipov. This was not Arkhipov's first brush with nuclear disaster. Born January 30th, 1926, in Staraya Kupavna near Moscow. Rural Russian family. Studied at the Pacific Higher Naval School, graduated in M47, served on minesweepers during the Soviet-Japanese War in M45, later transferred to submarines, serving in the Black Sea and Northern Fleet. By 1961, Arkhipov had risen to deputy commander of the nuclear submarine KT-19 on July 4th during K-19's maiden voyage in the North Atlantic. Disaster struck. The submarine's nuclear reactor cooling system failed. Temperature in the reactor compartment soared toward meltdown. If the reactor exploded, it would trigger the nuclear torpedoes and warheads aboard. The submarine would vanish in a nuclear fireball. Arkhipov led the repair team. He and 7 other men entered the reactor compartment wearing nothing but raincoats and gas masks. The radiation was so intense they could only work in short shifts, 10 minutes at a time. They improvised a cooling system using the submarine's drinking water. They welded pipes with their bare hands while radiation burned through their bodies. They saved the submarine. But 8 men from the repair team died within the next month from acute radiation syndrome. Another 15 died within 2 years, including the submarine's captain, who succumbed to radiation-induced cancer. Arkhipov survived, but the radiation exposure likely caused the kidney cancer that would kill him 37 years later. For his actions on K-19, Arkhipov received commendations. The Soviet government covered up the incident. The crew was sworn to secrecy. K-19 became known as Hiroshima among submariners who knew the truth. 1 year later, in October 1962, the Soviet Navy assigned Arkhipov to submarine B-59 as Brigade Chief of Staff. He would oversee the flotilla's operations during the Cuba mission. The captain of B-59 was Valentin Grigorievich Savitsky, experienced submariner, competent officer, but prone to anger under stress. The political officer was Ivan Semyonovich Maslenikov, a loyal Communist Party representative. The 3 men would have to work together, trust each other, make decisions that could affect millions of lives. They had no idea how soon that would happen. The 4 Soviet submarines began their journey to Cuba on October 1st, 1962. The mission was secret, the route dangerous. They had to cross the Atlantic without being detected by American anti-submarine warfare forces. Foxtrot-class submarines were diesel-powered. Unlike nuclear submarines, they couldn't stay submerged indefinitely. They needed to surface regularly to run their diesel engines, recharge batteries, and ventilate the interior. Maximum submerged speed, 15 knots. Maximum surfaced speed, 16 knots. Range 20,000 nautical miles surfaced. Only 380 nautical miles submerged at 2 knots. The submarines could stay underwater for about 5 days before the air became unbreathable and the batteries died. The crews didn't know that President Kennedy had announced the naval blockade of Cuba on October 22nd. They were running submerged by then, maintaining radio silence. They received no updates from Moscow. By October 24th, the 4 submarines were approaching the Caribbean. American naval forces were searching for them. The US Navy had deployed an entire carrier task force. The aircraft carrier U.S. Randolph, 11 destroyers, dozens of anti-submarine warfare aircraft, sonobuoys, multi-frequency sonars, every detection system available. On October 25th, American forces detected the first submarine, then the second, then the third. By October 27th, all 4 Soviet submarines were being tracked and harassed by American warships. The Americans used practice depth charges to signal the submarines to surface. Small explosive charges that produced loud underwater explosions, not designed to sink the submarines, just scare them to the surface. At least that's what the Americans thought. Inside B-59, it didn't feel like a signal. It felt like war. By October 27th, submarine B-59 had been underwater for nearly 5 days. The conditions inside were unbearable. Temperature between 120 and 140 degrees Fahrenheit in some compartments. The air conditioning had failed. The submarine's diesel engines couldn't be run underwater, so the cooling systems were offline. Oxygen levels dropped to 17%. Normal atmosphere is 21%. Below 19%, humans experience hypoxia, fatigue, confusion, impaired judgment, carbon dioxide levels dangerously high. Men were breathing air contaminated with CO2, hydrogen, and methane from the batteries. 10 crew members had already fainted from heat stroke. Others were vomiting. Some were hallucinating. The crew was drinking condensation water from the pipes to stay hydrated, rationing the last of their fresh water. They hadn't received radio communications from Moscow in days. They had no idea what was happening on the surface. Was war declared? Had the Americans already attacked Soviet forces? All they knew was that American destroyers were hunting them, and explosions were detonating all around the hull. Radio officer Vadim Orlov would later describe it as being inside a steel drum being beaten with hammers. At approximately 5:00 p.m. on October 27th, Captain Savitsky reached his breaking point. Another series of explosions rocked the submarine. The sonar operator reported 3 destroyers converging on their position, aircraft overhead, active sonar pinging against the hull. Savitsky was totally exhausted. The heat, the lack of oxygen, the stress of being hunted for days. His judgment was impaired. He turned to his officers and said words that nearly ended the world. "Maybe the war has already started up there, while we are doing somersaults here. We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not disgrace our navy." Savitsky ordered the weapons officer to assemble the nuclear torpedo. The T-5 torpedo sat in its tube in the forward compartment. 10-kiloton warhead, 2/3 the power of Hiroshima. If fired, it would travel at 30 knots toward the nearest American warship. The nuclear explosion would vaporize everything within a half-mile radius. The aircraft carrier USS Randolph, the destroyers USS Beale, USS Coney, USS Murray, thousands of American sailors, and it would be the first nuclear weapon used in combat since Nagasaki. The Americans would retaliate, Soviet forces in Cuba would respond, missiles would fly, the Strategic Air Command would launch bombers, Soviet ICBMs would rise from their silos, hundreds of millions dead within hours. Standard Soviet protocol required 3 officers to authorize the use of nuclear weapons aboard B-59. Captain Savitsky: "Yes, fire the torpedo." Political officer Maslenikov: "Yes, we must respond to this aggression." Brigade Chief of Staff Vasily Arkhipov: the third vote. The room fell silent. Savitsky was furious. The political officer was waiting. The weapons officer stood ready to load the nuclear torpedo into the firing tube. Arkhipov knew what firing meant. He'd been exposed to enough radiation from K-19 to know what nuclear weapons do. He'd seen men die from radiation poisoning, skin peeling off, organs failing, screaming in agony. He also knew something the others didn't fully consider in their oxygen-deprived state. If war had really started, the Americans wouldn't be wasting resources on one diesel submarine. They would have destroyed B-59 with high-explosive depth charges or torpedoes. The fact that they were using practice charges meant they wanted B-59 to surface, not sink. This wasn't war. This was a blockade enforcement operation. Arkhipov spoke calmly. "We will not fire the nuclear torpedo. We will surface and await orders from Moscow," Savitsky argued. The political officer protested. The temperature in the control room climbed above 130 degrees. Men stood watching the argument that would determine whether they lived or died, whether anyone lived or died. Arkhipov held firm. He was not just another officer. He was the brigade chief of staff, the flotilla commander's representative. His authority was equal to the captain's when it came to this decision. He said no, and under Soviet regulations, that meant the torpedo stayed in the tube. After what felt like an eternity, Savitsky backed down. He ordered the submarine to surface. At approximately 8:00 p.m. on October 27, 1962, submarine B-59 blew its ballast tanks and rose toward the surface. American sailors aboard the destroyers saw the submarine's conning tower break the surface. Blue-white lights flashed on. The submarine's crew opened the hatches and climbed onto the deck, gasping in the cool evening air. The Americans approached cautiously. They had no idea the submarine carried nuclear weapons. They thought this was routine. The commander of the American destroyer group signaled B-59. "Identify yourself. State your intentions." Captain Savitsky stood on the conning tower. Arkhipov stood beside him, both men exhausted, both men aware that moments ago they nearly destroyed the world. Savitsky responded in broken English that they were a Soviet submarine experiencing mechanical difficulties. The Americans allowed B-59 to proceed on the surface, escorted by destroyers, until it left the Caribbean. On October 28, 1962, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev announced that the Soviet Union would remove its missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American promise not to invade. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended. B-59 returned to Soviet waters in November 1962. The crew was debriefed. Savitsky filed a report. Arkhipov documented the incident. The Soviet government classified everything. For the next 40 years, almost no one outside the Soviet Navy knew how close B-59 came to firing a nuclear torpedo. Savitsky was not punished for his near decision to launch. The Soviet military understood the extreme conditions his crew had endured. The heat, the oxygen deprivation, the lack of communication. Arkhipov received no special recognition at the time. He had simply done his job, followed protocol, made the correct decision under pressure. He continued serving in the Soviet Navy, rose to the rank of Vice Admiral, commanded submarine divisions, helped train the next generation of submarine officers. He never spoke publicly about the B-59 incident during his lifetime. Soviet secrecy laws forbade it. In 1998, Vasily Arkhipov died of kidney cancer at age 72. The radiation exposure from K-19 in 1961 had likely caused the disease. He was buried quietly near Moscow. His widow, Olga, and his daughter, Yelena, mourned him as a devoted husband and father, a man who served his country with honor. They had no idea the world owed him a debt it could never repay. In October 2002, on the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, historians organized a conference in Havana. American and Soviet veterans gathered to discuss the crisis. That's when retired Commander Vadim Orlov, the radio intelligence officer from B-59, told the full story. He described the conditions inside the submarine, the heat reaching 140 degrees, the oxygen dropping to dangerous levels, Captain Savitsky's fury, the order to prepare the nuclear torpedo, and Archipov's refusal. Thomas Blanton, director of the US National Security Archive, listened to Orlov's account in stunned silence. After the session, Blanton said, "A guy called Vasily Arkhipov saved the world." The revelation shocked historians on both sides. American officials confirmed that on October 27, 1962, they had no idea the Soviet submarines carried nuclear torpedoes. They thought the depth charges were harmless signals. If B-59 had fired that nuclear torpedo, the USS Randolph and its escorts would have been destroyed. Thousands of American sailors dead. President Kennedy would have faced enormous pressure to retaliate. Strategic Air Command bombers were already on high alert. Minuteman missiles were ready to launch. The entire nuclear arsenal was primed. Military analysts concluded that nuclear escalation would have been nearly inevitable. The United States had over 3,000 nuclear warheads ready for immediate use. The Soviet Union had about 500. Both sides would have launched everything. Estimates of casualties range from 300 million to 500 million dead in the first week. Most of Europe destroyed. Most of North America destroyed. The Soviet Union reduced to radioactive rubble. Nuclear winter would have followed. Ash and debris blocking the sun. Global temperatures plummeting. Crops failing worldwide. Famine killing the survivors. Human civilization might not have recovered. One man stopped it by saying one word: no. In 2017, 19 years after Archipov's death, the Future of Life Institute presented the first Future of Life Award to the Arkhipov family. On October 27, 2017, exactly 55 years after Black Saturday, a ceremony was held. Max Tegmark, president of the Future of Life Institute, presented Archipov's daughter, Yelena Andriukova, and his grandson Sergei with the award and 50,000. Tegmark said, "Vasily Arkhipov single-handedly prevented nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. His decision to refuse launching a nuclear torpedo against US warships likely saved more lives than have been lost in all of history's wars combined." Yelena accepted the award with tears in her eyes. "My father never talked about this. He was a modest man. He believed he was just doing his duty." The award citation read, "For extraordinary service to humanity in refusing to fire a nuclear torpedo during the Cuban Missile Crisis, thereby preventing what could have become a nuclear holocaust." Other Soviet submarine veterans from the crisis attended the ceremony. Vadim Orlov, the radio officer who had witnessed the confrontation, was there. He confirmed every detail. Vasily Arkhipov was a hero, Orlov said, not because he wanted glory, but because when everyone else panicked, he stayed calm. When everyone else wanted to fight, he chose to think. Today, October the 27th, is sometimes called the day the world didn't end. Black Saturday, 1962, the most dangerous day of the Cold War. Major Rudolf Anderson died that day when Soviet missiles destroyed his U-2 over Cuba. He's buried in South Carolina. His name is engraved on memorials. His sacrifice is remembered. But Vasily Arkhipov saved more lives than any medal could honor. And for 40 years, nobody knew. The B-59 incident is now taught at the US Naval War College, at Russian military academies, at the CIA training facility in Virginia, at intelligence schools worldwide. The lesson is simple. Nuclear weapons don't just threaten millions of lives. They also depend on the judgment of individuals under unimaginable stress. On October 27, 1962, that judgment came down to 3 votes in a steel tube beneath the Caribbean. 2 said yes, 1 said no. The heat was 40 degrees, the oxygen was running out, communications were impossible, the captain was exhausted and furious, explosions were hammering the hull, and one man kept his head. Imagine the pressure. You're 36 years old, you've been underwater for 5 days, you can barely breathe. You're drenched in sweat. Your captain is screaming to launch the nuclear weapon. The political officer agrees. Everyone around you thinks war has started. You have seconds to decide. Launch, and you might be defending your country. You might be following orders. You might be doing what any loyal Soviet officer would do. Or you might be starting World War III, killing hundreds of millions, ending human civilization. You don't know which. You can't contact Moscow. You can't surface to find out. You have to choose. Right now. Arkhipov chose peace. He chose doubt over certainty. He chose restraint over vengeance. He said no, and the world survived. Historians now know that October the 27th, 1962 was even more dangerous than anyone realized at the time. At 10:17 a.m. that morning, U.S. Air Force Major Rudolph Anderson took off from McCoy Air Force Base in Florida. His mission? Photograph Soviet missile sites in Cuba from 7,500 feet. At 12:22 p.m., 2 Soviet S-75 Dvina surface-to-air missiles were fired at his U-2. The missiles were fired on the orders of 2 Soviet generals in Havana, acting without authorization from Moscow. The first missile missed. The second exploded near Anderson's aircraft. Shrapnel punctured his pressure suit and cockpit. He died instantly. His U-2 crashed near Baines, Cuba. Anderson became the only American killed by enemy fire during the entire Cuban Missile Crisis. He was 35 years old, married, left behind 2 young children. His death nearly triggered American retaliation. President Kennedy's military advisors urged him to launch airstrikes against Cuba immediately. Some wanted a full invasion. Kennedy refused. He chose to give diplomacy one more day. That same morning, another American U-2 pilot accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace near Alaska. Soviet air defense tracked him. Soviet MiG fighters scrambled to intercept. American F-102 fighters armed with nuclear air-to-air missiles launched to escort the U-2 home. For a few terrifying minutes, nuclear-armed aircraft from both sides were airborne in the same region. One mistake, one misunderstood signal, and they might have engaged. The U-2 pilot realized his navigation error and turned back. The crisis passed. Most Americans never knew it happened. And deep beneath the Caribbean, Captain Savitsky was ordering the nuclear torpedo armed. 3 separate nuclear incidents, all on the same day. Anyone could have triggered World War III. Rudolph Anderson didn't get a choice. Soviet missiles killed him. The U-2 pilot over Alaska got lucky. His navigation equipment malfunctioned, but he corrected course in time. Vasily Arkhipov had a choice, and he chose correctly. 3 incidents, 1 day. 1 survived because of skill, 1 survived because of luck, and 1 survived because one man said no. If you study the Cold War, you learn about deterrence theory. Mutually assured destruction, the balance of terror that supposedly kept the peace. The theory said that no rational leader would start a nuclear war because both sides would be annihilated. Everyone loses, so everyone refrains. But deterrence theory assumes rational decision-making, clear communication, perfect information, leaders with time to think. October 27th, 1962 had none of those. Submarine B-59's captain was exhausted, oxygen deprived, and operating on incomplete information. He thought war might have started. He thought his submarine was under lethal attack. He wanted to defend his crew and his nation. That's not irrational. That's human. Deterrence theory also assumes leaders have control over their weapons. But in the chaos of crisis, control breaks down. Soviet generals in Cuba fired surface-to-air missiles without Moscow's authorization and killed Rudolph Anderson. American anti-submarine forces dropped depth charges on B-59 without knowing the submarine had nuclear weapons. Systems failed. Communications broke down. Men made decisions in isolation that could have killed millions. And one man, in the worst possible circumstances, made the right decision. The B-59 incident reveals a terrifying truth. Nuclear deterrence depends on luck as much as strategy. We got lucky that Arkhipov was aboard that submarine. Lucky that Soviet regulations required 3 votes instead of 2. Lucky that Arkhipov had survived K-19 and understood what nuclear weapons really mean. Change any one of those factors, and the world ends. What if Arkhipov had died from radiation on K-19? Someone else would have been Brigade Chief of Staff. Would they have said no? What if Soviet regulations only required 2 votes? Savitsky and Maslenikov would have launched. No third vote to stop them. What if the American destroyers had used real depth charges instead of practice charges? B-59 might have sunk, or Savitsky might have launched in desperation. We live in a world that survived by the thinnest margin. A 36-year-old submarine officer's judgment call in a 140-degree heat with 17% oxygen. That's not a robust system, that's a miracle. Modern militaries study the B-59 incident obsessively. At the US Naval War College, it's used to teach crisis decision-making under stress. How do you make rational choices when you're exhausted, scared, and isolated? At Russian military academies, it's used to teach the importance of communication and clear rules of engagement. How do you ensure submarine commanders have enough guidance without micromanaging them? At intelligence agencies worldwide, it's used to teach about fog of war. How do you avoid catastrophic mistakes when you don't know what the enemy knows? But the most important lesson is simpler. Nuclear weapons are not just machines. They're decisions made by human beings under pressure. And human beings make mistakes. Vasily Arkhipov didn't make a mistake, but he easily could have. He was in the worst possible situation to make a life-or-death decision affecting millions. Heat, hypoxia, exhaustion, confusion, incomplete information, pressure from his captain and political officer. Every factor pushed him towards saying yes. He said no anyway. Why? We don't know for certain. Arkhipov never gave a detailed public interview about his reasoning. He died before historians fully understood the B-59 incident. But based on accounts from Vadim Orlov and other crew members, we can reconstruct his thinking. Arkhipov noticed something important. If the Americans wanted to sink B-59, they already would have. They had destroyers, aircraft, torpedoes, depth charges. They could have obliterated the submarine. Instead, they were using practice charges. Small explosions designed to signal, not kill. That suggested they wanted B-59 to surface, not die, which meant war probably hadn't started. This was a confrontation, not combat. Arkhipov also understood nuclear weapons better than most. He'd been exposed to radiation from K-19. He'd seen what it does to human bodies. 8 men died horrible deaths in front of him. Another 15 died later. Nuclear weapons weren't abstract to him. They were burned skin and vomiting blood and organs shutting down. If he fired that torpedo, thousands of men would die like that. American sailors who were just following orders, men with families, men who didn't know how close they were to death. And then the retaliation would come. Soviet forces in Cuba incinerated. Moscow, Leningrad, every Soviet city, including Staraya Kupavna, the small town near Moscow where Arkhipov's family lived. He understood what he would be unleashing, so he said no. Not because he was a hero, not because he wanted glory, but because he thought clearly when everyone else panicked. That's the lesson. Heroism isn't about charging into battle. Sometimes it's about refusing to fight. Sometimes it's about standing alone and saying no when everyone else says yes. If this story mattered to you, do something for me right now. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube's algorithm to show this story to more people. Stories like this don't get told unless people like you make them visible. Hit subscribe and click the notification bell. We're pulling stories like this from declassified archives, historical conferences, and forgotten records every single week. Real decisions, real consequences, real people who changed history. Drop a comment right now, tell me where you're watching from. Doesn't matter if you're in the United States, Russia, India, Brazil, wherever. This story belongs to everyone. If you'd heard of Vasily Arkhipov before watching this video, or just type "Thank you, Vasily," so we know you're here. You're not just a viewer, you're part of making sure stories like this aren't forgotten. You're part of remembering that one person, in the right moment, with the right choice, can change everything. Our community is tens of thousands strong now, from dozens of countries. Every single one of you matters. One more thing, share this video, text it to someone you know who's into Cold War history. Post it on Reddit, tweet it, whatever. This story deserves a bigger audience. Thank you for watching, thank you for making sure October 27th, 1962 stays alive in memory. Thank you for making sure Vasily Arkhipov's decision is remembered as the world-saving moment it was. These weren't just submarines, these were decisions, choices made by exhausted men in impossible situations, and one of those men got it right. See you in the next story.